Okay, so I apologise in advance. I have a little bit of a sore throat, so if I descend into frog-like demeanour halfway through, I apologise. My name is Gillian Golden, and I'm a third-year part-time PhD fellow here in the Dynamics Lab, and I also work as a statistician for the Department of Education. So my research is on microsimulation approaches to analysing policy for Irish primary schools, and I suppose I'm looking at it from the point of view of a researcher, but I'm trying as much as possible to make the research practical to the work of the policy areas in the Department of Education, or the work to education policymakers in general. So it's looking at how microsimulation approaches can help policy analysts in the education sector. So the notion of education as a complex dynamic system is gaining ground, especially in recent years. I think there's work ongoing in the large international organisations. So UNESCO are doing some work in this area. The OECD actually have a whole research group just looking at how to govern complex education systems. And so the idea of the education system as a complex system, and I think naturally just people can understand that it is a complex system as we'd understand it. There's large numbers of different actors, institutions, very complex interactions between all the players. It has the characteristics, so for example, self-organisation in the Irish system, for example, all schools are resourced equally, but how they utilise these resources and how choices are made in allocating resources, and how schools that are located close to each other choose to highlight particular resource areas. So there's an element there of self-organisation, and again the notion of emergence. So if you're looking at which models of education or which thematic areas kind of gain ground and which ones don't. So in Ireland, for example, you look at for example, the Montessori method of education is extremely popular at pre-primary level, but almost non-existent at primary level. And in other countries, it would be a very popular model at primary level. And so it's trying to understand, different grassroots movements, how provision can grow in a very short period of time. So a recent example from Ireland again would be the Educate Together movement for multi-denominational schooling. Most of the Irish system is still Catholic provision, but the Educate Together movement, there had been attempts to start movements previously in this area, and they'd never gained ground, and then literally this movement just exploded overnight. So it's trying to understand how these phenomena can come about, and how, as a policymaker, how to deal with them and how to prepare for them. And then again, so looking at feedback loops, and how the school choice for parents, school reputation can be self-reinforcing as parents choose not to send their children to schools with poor reputations and so on. So I think the notion of education as a complex system is well established. And so for policymakers, you're left with the question of how can you actually affect change. So if you look at the system where you have different models for finance, school governance, curriculum, resources, you have outside the school, you have the parents influencing the system, you have the wider society, you have the economy, and you have a series of policy objectives that in some way are fed by maybe society and economy, and then you're trying to, as a policymaker, figure out where do you apply the initiatives, or where do you apply the changes in the system, or how many different places do you apply changes in the system in order to get them to actually take effect and to diffuse far enough through the system that they actually become the norm. And so this is the challenge of the education policymaker. And so Mark Mason, who's done a lot of work in this area for the OECD and UNESCO, he argues, given the complexity inherent in education systems, that changing education systems to rid them of their inequities and inefficiencies requires massive interventions at all levels of the system, to which it should be added that substantial interventions at many levels of the society in which the education system is embedded would also be a prerequisite for sustainable change. So, I mean, that's wonderful, obviously, but in reality, I don't think any government in the world actually has the resources to implement this in practice, and particularly when there's no lack, given that it is a complex system, there's no lack of certainty, even when you're applying the resources, that you actually will ever get to this critical mass of effecting the change that you require. So from the point of view of the policymaker then, who's trying to implement a policy or make a change in the system, you have the options maybe of testing the policy on a small scale. But again, given the nature of the system, that, you know, whatever you may observe in just one part of the system may not, in a linear way, diffuse out to the rest of the system. So you can't always assume that, you know, what you test in a small case study can be generalized out to the system. And so this is particularly important when you're looking at spending money, because you can maybe spend a small amount of money to do a little pilot project, but then you're spending that multiplied by, you know, 4,000 or 5,000 maybe to get the same effect across the system. And also in the Irish case in particular, you'll see this, the system isn't very homogeneous there, so even where you test can make a huge difference in the effects that you'll see. So then again, and this is a model that's been employed by the Department of Education in recent years, is you have scarce resources, so you prioritise them to the areas of the system that are judged to most require intervention. And again, there are issues here. I suppose there's a moral hazard there in that you're essentially ignoring the rest of the areas of the system, and then it's again not always clear whether the resources will achieve the desired effect. And so another option that a policymaker has is maybe trying to model the system and simulate possible outcomes to get some insight into where to apply interventions. And obviously this always involves simplification and reduction in complexity compared to the real life system, but I suppose that's the area that I'm focusing my research on. And again, so when you're looking at modelling an education system, the benefits are, I mean, obviously we can't really experiment with the real system. It gives an ability to get insight into possible policy effects, and as time goes on and models are developed, they can be made more complex and they can incorporate more of the complexity of the system and more factors over time. So looking in particular at the Irish primary school system, so there's approximately 540,000 pupils in the system, over 3,200 schools. The vast majority of the schools are privately owned, publicly funded, denominational schools. Compared to a lot of other developed countries in particular, I would say there's a relatively large proportion of rural small primary schools. 43% of all schools in the system have less than 100 pupils, and the smaller schools then have completely different characteristics. They have multi-grade classes, they have smaller class sizes, they're located in sometimes quite remote areas, and so it's very difficult when it comes to resource allocation to develop a one-size-fits-all policy. So even when you're trying to decide how to allocate teachers according to a pupil-teacher ratio, it's much more difficult given the issues that are there with the smaller schools and multi-grade standards and so on. So what I believe microsimulation can offer is it allows the effects of proposed policies to be simulated and tested synthetically before being adopted. And it follows naturally when you're devising policies that will directly impact on individuals' lives, such as education policies, to model the impacts on an individual level. And resource planning can be tailored to specific areas and sections of the population. So looking in particular at spatial microsimulation, I mean, again, just rather than give a few bullet points of the benefits, I think this elucidates it very clearly. So you have your statistical table here, which tells you, you know, the proportions are there in each ethnic group and so on. But I mean, looking at it visually, I think everybody in this room is quite aware of that. I mean, you immediately get a sense of the level of integration in Washington, D.C. in this example. So looking at building a model, so the data sources that I used are, there's a Census data set from Census 2011, which is a complete micro data set on primary school children, anonymised obviously, with abstracted school location information. And then from within the Department of Education and Skills, there's a suite of school level information available. And so the model is built by combining the data spatially. So it's using a spatial operation to take the abstracted school location and trying to assign that using the geographic coordinates of the place of schools as available in the Department of Education and Skills. And you can see it leads to a very rich data set with a lot of variables that reflect both the pupils' home environment and socioeconomic context. Also their a lot of school level information, including resources that are allocated to the school, type of school, teachers, medium of instruction, and then also you have the geographic information and the possibility to integrate the underlying community information. So just a little bit of technical discussion about model validation and data cleaning. So what one issue I came across when I was building the model was how to code the missing place of school. So there's about 7% in total of the records that don't have a place of school. They're completely blank or uncodable. And so I took a machine learning approach to this. So basically using the overall data set that I had, the 93% that did have a place of school as the training set, I tried to validate between itself using tenfold cross-validation, and then use that to predict the values of the missing schools. And the variable that I used to validate on was I generated this near table, which was basically a proximity table of schools according to the location of each individual person. So it was a massive, massive table, and then used that to figure out which proportion of pupils were actually going to their nearest school, their second nearest school, their third nearest school, and so on. And then use that as the basis for assigning probabilities to the blanks that they were going to their nearest, second nearest, and so on. So I suppose a difficulty that's there. So again, sorry, just to say also, another issue that I had, which was where you have two schools geographically located very, very close to each other. It's not possible then in those cases to actually discern which school the pupil is going to. So in that case, it was a matter of reassigning the pupils geographically. So using a bin packing algorithm. There are very few of those actually in the system. When you account for, the merging and so on is done by gender. So when you account for that, there are actually, most of them are in dense urban areas. So then it's, I suppose, the question that I'm working on at the moment is how to actually arrive at a validation measure for the data set, internal validation measure. And the literature is quite light on validating a microsimulation model. So, there's a couple of different approaches that could be taken. But it's just trying to find a way, I suppose, that could be considered to be a robust measure. I suppose my sense is that it's quite a high-quality data set, but trying to actually show that numerically, and again, given, obviously you can come up with a measure of validation for the model as a whole, but then there's also the question of, within the model, there are some schools, for example, those that were subjected to the bin packing algorithm where the assignment is not as valid as those that are in a remote rural area where clearly this is the school that all the pupils are attending. So that's something that I'm looking at the moment. And from the point of view of external validation, I also have the capacity to check the Department of Education census totals for the relevant academic year against the matched records on a school-by-school basis. So this, sorry, just seeing the axes are actually cut off it, but this is basically showing for each individual school, so for all 3,000 odd schools in the system, the number of records that was matched from the census record, the census microdata, against the actual totals of the school from the September before. So you can see again, it's kind of difficult to see, but down here at the small school level, they're quite similar. We wouldn't expect them to be exactly the same anyway, because pupils move around during the academic year, and then the larger schools you see a greater disparity, and so that's another measure of validation as well that can be included. So this is just an example then of the type of simulation that I did using the model. This was an initial, I suppose, test case or proof of concept that I did, and it was looking at some of the effects of amalgamation of small rural schools in County Mayo, which is on the western seaboard, and it's probably where the highest concentration of small schools in the country are. So this was basically what the schools looked like pre the simulated amalgamation. These were basically what the simulation did was to close all schools with less than 50 pupils and actually reassign them to the nearest geographical school to the one that they were attending. And so I was looking then at some of the effects of that. So using department data, for example, I was able to bring in costings and calculate unit costs for each individual pupil in the data set based on their teacher allocations and their capitation funding. And then it was looking at, I suppose, what the unit cost would have been in the amalgamated schools. And so we were able to calculate, we were able to calculate an idea of what the cost saving would have been if everyone was going to these larger schools rather than the smaller schools. So it's something that has kind of direct practical relevance for policymakers, that it's something they can look at and say, well, what about if this was no longer there, is there actually a cost saving to be made? And you can actually answer that question. And something else the policymakers are very interested in is around the, I suppose, the socioeconomic homogeneity of the system. So I suppose the department in particular is very interested in the example from Finland, which has very high academic achievement scores, and their schools are notable for actually within them being, I suppose, representative of the population at large. And I don't think anybody agrees that having a system where you have in one school a large proportion of people from a higher socioeconomic background and another with a lower is a good model for equality in the system. So again, it's looking at, I suppose this is what you could deem the current situation as it was in County Mayo, the different types. So this is looking at basically the proportion of the lowest to the highest socioeconomic group, and obviously around the centre is the more equal schools. So it's looking, you can see clearly there's a huge disparity in the socioeconomic profile of the schools, and then it's looking at, given if the same pupils were amalgamated into a larger school, what would that actually do to the socioeconomic profile of the schools? And you can see in general it's, this was just an initial test case, but you can see it kind of pushes a lot of the profiles in towards the middle of the graph. So again, I suppose it's just an example of how it gives a useful marker to a policymaker on what might happen if these types of policies were implemented. So just using the model, it is useful for modelling, it is useful for modelling the relation between individual schools, pupils and local communities. Obviously, it could be extended by adding in, for example, information on teachers and classes within the model, and possibly adding a temporal dimension as well. So it's, I suppose the focus that I'm taking is looking at how I can profile the schools using the metrics derived from the pupil data, and that's where I'm focusing my research. But I think this type of model has value beyond what I'm doing. It's something maybe that could be extended out, that policymakers could use. And so I suppose where I'm now moving on to focus my own research is looking at the geographical network analysis of primary schools. So it's basically, now that I have this model there and I have every pupil matched to their school, it's looking at the actual network structure geographically of the school. So it's seeing, if you think of the school as being dots on a map, for example, made up of all the pupils in the school there, it's actually looking at what that looks like. Are they quite densely packed in are catchment areas small, large, what the type of topology of those networks are, whether they can be classified or grouped in certain ways. So what are the characteristics of the networks? Are they, in rural areas, do they all follow the similar kind of pattern? Like when I was doing the test case in County Mayo, we saw ones that looked almost like donuts, where you have the school in a very remote rural area, you have people living around the school but they're not attending the school, and then you have a wider circle of people coming from maybe local towns or other rural areas that actually are attending the school. So again, that's the type of thing that you can model quite well using this type of a network. And again, from a policy point of view, it's of interest to the Department of Education, for example. How does the network topology, so how does the actual situation on the ground mesh with what the department thinks are the geographical catchment area of the school? And so there's probably a huge question of interest there. Can the networks be categorised or typified in some way? Trying to identify communities, so looking at is the school network reflective of the underlying community network? And then again, if the networks can be categorised, are there particular categories of school networks that are associated with other school profiling factors? So just taking, for example, this is again an area of interest at the moment within our own area, but what is the relationship between the network density of a school, the socioeconomic profile of the local area and the socioeconomic profile of the school? So at the moment the department is reviewing how to allocate resources to schools with socioeconomic disadvantage, and it's trying to come up, I suppose, it's always been traditionally done by surveying the principals who have an interest obviously in putting, I suppose, inflating some of the social issues on the survey because there's money coming at the end of it, so it almost becomes a competitive process for the resources. So it's trying to find a more reliable method for profiling the schools. And I suppose, you know, is there a relationship if you have a very tight school network, then is it sufficient to look at the underlying socioeconomic profile of the area and say that that's actually reflective of the socioeconomic profile of the school, or does the socioeconomic profile of the members of the school reflect the area as a whole? And so these are the types of questions that I'm going to be looking at, as how can the network analysis of the primary schools add to profiling them. And again, similar to as I was showing with the Mayo example, from the point of view of the policymaker then looking to test hypotheses, you know, simulation can be used to actually test if I was to modify this network to be more like the one over here, is it likely that the profile of the school would change, and so on. So so I guess those are the areas I think that will probably form the basis of my research going forward, using the model. But as I said, I suppose what I'm really trying to prove underlying all of this is that there is actually a value in using this type of tool and using data-driven analysis, using microsimulation in public policy in general, and I suppose coming up with a more robust way of allocating resources. So yeah, thank you very much for your So I don't know if you have any questions. Or
can I
yes.
I'm just curious. Is the population in Ireland increasing or decreasing, or stable?
Increasing. There's a huge demographic issue actually at the primary level at the moment. We've seen a massive surge in enrolments in the last few years. So yeah, I think the highest proportion.
Very relevant.
Oh yeah, absolutely, and that's probably what's driving a lot of this, is that the resources. It's difficult to keep up with the demand that's been put on the system by the demographic factors.
So the second point, I guess, is more technical. When do you decide that your simulation has reached the optimum point? That is, you can always continue to work for the reduction of cost and so forth. So how do you select the optimal point? Is like, this is the model I'm going to propose it.
Well, I guess it's really fed by the policy objectives. So it's at the point where you feel that you've met the policy objectives. But I know, I suppose, from a more practical point of view, thinking from from my other hat, it's I suppose you're trying to think of how you're getting the best value for money. And I know that's kind of a nebulous concept in itself. But it's more because it's a static simulation anyway, where you're always comparing the now with the now how it would look elsewhere. Then it means obviously the situation will have changed in the interim anyway. But it's I suppose, because it is a simplification of the actual system anyway, it's more just to maybe get indications of where this would be a good place to concentrate resources. And so I don't think optimality is probably ever reached with.
Just two more quick questions.
Yeah, sure.
The network, is it possible for you to tie your network analysis to the cost-benefit analysis? So it seemed to me that I didn't catch it. That is your network aspect.
Oh yeah, but sorry, so it's geographic network. So it's
right. Well, is that tied in eventually to the cost-benefit analysis or not?
Well, it's more, I guess, looking at by profiling the schools according to the types of networks, that you can see maybe what's working and what isn't, even in the existing system, and maybe then that would give an indication of where to focus resources after that point. So it's I suppose it's all tied. I suppose what you're looking at is maybe characterizing the networks, and then you're trying to come up with some metric of this is the type of network you want in the system, and what can we do to foster that, or this is the type of school profile that. So given the example of the socioeconomic profiles, obviously equality in schools would be a huge issue. So if you're profiling those type of schools, then you're trying to see what you can do to put the conditions in place for that to be.
More macro concern. The last question.
Yes.
Is would the politics make any difference?
Oh yes, yes.
See, I was thinking about the case of the farmers in Japan. There's a very few people engaging in farming in Japan, but they're very powerful because
the same in Ireland.
geographically
Yeah,
the politicians, in the national government, nobody would touch the subsidy to the farmers. So that it looks like that your schools get public support, so they're definitely subsidized. So you're taking it away for the elected officials. So it's,
well,
I don't know how do you model that.
Yeah, no, it's, I mean, from the point of view of modelling it, I don't know that it's actually possible in this context at least, but I think it can actually be used as a tool for policymakers when dealing with the politics almost. That I think sometimes, like again using the example of small schools, like that's a huge political issue in Ireland, to the extent where I think the minister has recently said that we're not, even though clearly, you know, we can see the minister has said we're not going to be closing any more small schools in the near future. But at the very least, I think what the data can do is give hard evidence that this is the case. Whereas I think previously you can do reviews and you can do case studies, but you know the lobby can always argue that, you know, this. So I think it gives evidence maybe that's you know, that's possible to use as a tool in these types of discussions maybe.
Question. So you mentioned this phenomenon of the donut effect, whereby you've got a school and then you've got a catchment of people. They're not necessarily going to that school. Maybe the people outside of it are going. Are these in situations where maybe that school is very wealthy, or you know, the particular context you're talking about?
It's actually more in the context of Mayo anyway. What it mostly is our own sense is that it's schools that are struggling to stay open. So it's actually, again, it's politics, I guess, in a sense that you have cases where there are very small schools in rural areas, and basically, I think, you know, in some cases the school staff is probably bringing in their nieces and nephews from the local town to go to the school just to get numbers, basically. So it's, and I suppose that goes against the political argument then that small schools are the, you know, the beating heart of the local community and so on. So I think that's where this type of thing can add value to actually.
Yeah, because you're trying to align, for example, geographic proximity of students with the school itself. So in the Mayo example, I was wondering, there was a 10 million cost saving mentioned, and a number of schools closed as a result. That 10 million cost saving, does that take into account, you know, things like the savings and costs of, say, transport to get those students who have their school closed down, or is this about geographic?
No, that was just a gross saving, so it wouldn't include, like, for example, the cost of extending or building new schools and so on.
And the social cost as well, like you got a village, a school, a shop might close down.
Exactly, yeah, and I think that was something that I didn't mention it here, but when I presented the wider, you know, results previously, I suppose I was trying to make the distinction then between those schools that actually are hubs in the community and those that aren't, and trying to demonstrate which variables in the model could actually be useful for distinguishing between them. So
I suppose it depends where the priority of the policy is, if it's more macro government policy or is it a specific, you know, education budget policy, you know, that has different ways in terms of
exactly. And again, it's something I think that can feed into other policy areas, in that I suppose the focus when I was looking at this is looking at closing schools, but actually if you find that there perhaps is a community, you know, working with the Department of the Environment, you find that there's a community that maybe would benefit from a school opening in an area. I mean, that's also the type of thing that it can be used for. So, yeah. So.
Questions? What does the type in the geographic networks stand for? What is the type?
Oh, it's literally that the pupil is attending the school. So that's the tie. It's just that the pupil is associated with the school because they're attending there.
The geographic tie.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's a geographic rather than I suppose a social tie.
What is the actor in the network? What is the actor in the not schools?
What are the actors? Sorry?
What does the node stand for?
What are the actors in the network?
In the networks, yeah. I
The-
suppose it is schools, but I do not know why there is a type. And then you said the type stands for the pupils.
Oh no, sorry. I mean that there's the actors, the pupils, and the school if you like. So it's looking at the relationship only between the pupils and the school, and the tie between them is actually just the link, the fact that the pupil is attending the school. So it's the geographical tie between the pupil is associated with the school because they're attending it. I don't know, is that?
And there are two networks. There are two modes networks.
There.
So we don't know that we don't have the social network of pupils. That's what you mean by two modes.
Oh.
We don't have the network of the
No. Sorry, it's a geographic network. So sorry, I know we're using the term network, but it's looking at the topology of the geographic network rather than looking at the social ties between the pupils or looking at this. Is that what you mean? More?
It's like a relation network. The pupils are related to the school, so they have
Exactly. Yes. Yeah. You could think of it as an entity relationship type thing.
If the social network, they're going to everybody else.
Yeah.
That kind of network.
So they're not like friendship ties, or so.
Yeah.
Then how? Yeah.
Simple question.
Yeah.
What software are you using for analyzing?
Well, the joining, the spatial joining and all of that is done using ArcGIS, and then for the cross validations I was using R, and for the simulations I was using either R or SAS, depending on. So.
You also have educational outcomes of students,
Mhm.
which is not something you brought up, but it would obviously be quite controversial. But you could
Yeah.
map the network structure to explain variation in education outcomes, which would be really impactful, I thought, in terms of rationales for restructuring schools, let's put it that way.
Yeah, well, I think Coleman's presentation on the new EU data protection regulation will probably,
Yes.
there'll be nothing like that done for a long time, I
Well,
guess.
we can do
After,
it here,
but
don't tell anybody.
yeah, yeah, worth a try. Yeah.
So this reminds me of the president's 1960s. I'm sure you've heard of it. The United States tried a busing system.
Oh yeah, yeah.
And the idea was that by busing minority students, majority white student-dominant schools, we don't want to improve the minority students'
Integration.
actual performance. But it turned out that they would do almost unworkable because the parents objected to the students being bused long distance, and eventually the whole system pretty much collapsed. So it's just it's very interesting that you could construct the ideal
Mm-hmm.
optimum solutions to increase or decrease the inequality in the students.
And then in practice they can actually, yeah.
Practice.
Yeah, that's true.
Wondering the cost savings, that was the government spending cost savings.
That was the cost saving that would accrue to the government annually, yeah.
I wonder if it would be interesting to look at the cost that would be incurred by the families that are transporting their children.
Yeah.
Or like, is the cost disappearing, or is it being transferred? Or some of the cost being transferred onto the...
As a result of the yeah, well, I
like
guess something
school
like,
down the road closed, so now we can't go there, we have to drive.
yeah, well, I guess for something like school transport, what you find with these small rural schools as well is that in the most cases the Department of Education is paying, unless they live right near the school, the Department of Education is paying for transport and so on. But I mean, I accept the point, obviously there could be other costs, and yeah, interesting.